I've spoken with over 1,500 wealth advisors on LinkedIn, and 95% of them have never gotten a client from the platform. Whereas the advisors I work with are consistently able to add 2 to 3 high net worth ideal clients every single month, and as a result are able to add millions in AUM to their practice monthly with a consistent strategy. The reason most advisors fail usually comes down to one or multiple of these 5 mistakes that I'm going to go over in this video. Hopefully you get some actionable advice to solve some of these problems that you may already be seeing. Let's get into it. So the first mistake that I see wealth advisors making on LinkedIn that consistently happens with pretty much any of them that don't get clients on the platform actually has nothing to do with content or DMs or targeting or any of that stuff, which obviously I'll get into in this video. But really the first element is having a desperate salesy mindset. Right? Unfortunately, the industry has that perception now where most prospects just think wealth advisors are salesmen with their own interests at heart and not really thinking or not really genuine on the prospect side. Even though that's not really the case, right? Most wealth advisors just truly want to help people and make that impact in people's lives. But in the end, they never get the time of day. And it starts with this desperate mindset. Even if you are a genuine wealth advisor who genuinely wants to make a positive impact, which I think I've seen in pretty much every single wealth advisor I've spoken to, the main factor that then holds you back in your sales process is approaching every conversation just wanting to sell, right? It completely turns prospects away. And even if you think it's not evident and you're trying to be genuine and you're trying to have a real conversation, if at your core, your real mentality is just to get the sale or just to add people as clients, it's going to be evident, right? Especially when we're talking about DMs, and obviously we'll get into the whole DM side of these mistakes in a second. But really, it's so evident in your tonality that you're trying to find their problems in a very desperate way. You're trying to sell them at all costs, right? You're trying to maybe pitch them too early. Whatever the case may be, this is a consistent problem, and honestly, one of the easiest ones to solve. It's probably also the most impactful solution that you could have, because once you're able to approach conversations and approach prospects from a place of genuinely wanting to help, genuinely wanting to just understand their scenario, it makes it so much easier and so much more natural. And also kind of leading into the next point I'm going to talk about, it stands out from what every other advisor is doing, right? And so again, it's not necessarily the easiest thing to do. And one of the big factors in all the advisors I work with is we really talk about a lot of mindset changes. It comes from knowing what your goal is in the conversation at every single stage. Maybe in the beginning, when you first start in your DM conversation with someone, you don't just talk about finances and business, you actually talk about the things that make you guys human, right? The real personal connections that you had. We'll obviously get into a lot of this in a second, and you can check out some of my other videos to get deeper into the strategy. But the first change you really have to make, and the most common mistake, is just being desperate, right? And I get it, you have to sign clients, you need to hit maybe certain AUM targets. Obviously, you have maybe big passions for your business. You want to grow your book so you can serve your family, whatever the case may be. But in the end, you have to understand that none of that desperation is going to be motivation enough for you to close clients, right? You have to be very genuine, very casual, and very lighthearted in your conversations in order to actually see an impact. That's a huge factor in our strategy and one of the crucial reasons why we're able to see success consistently. So the second most common mistake that wealth advisors make on LinkedIn is blending in. Whether it comes to content or DMs, and more specifically the conversations that you have in the DMs, pretty much every single wealth advisor sounds the same. Now there's a lot of reasons for this, right? There's, as I said in the beginning, pretty much every wealth advisor wants to get clients on LinkedIn, wants to try to do it in some way, but all of the outreach basically sounds the same, right? Especially if you're going after more ideal, more higher net worth prospects, they get the same exact types of DMs in their inbox all day long from wealth advisors trying to pitch them, right? We'll get into what those DMs look like in a second, but just overall having the mindset of being the same as other advisors really hurts. That means that all the DMs that you send sound the same. Nothing is really unique. It doesn't really talk anything personally about yourself, right? And a lot of it kind of goes back to what I was saying in the last mistake, which is being desperate and pitchy, right? Once you get past that stage where you're no longer trying to be desperate, you're in the right mindset, you're trying to be genuine, now you have to think about how can you actually stand out. With all the DMs that we do, our goal in the conversation is to talk to the prospect like no other wealth advisor has approached them before on LinkedIn. That comes from not just the initial message, not just the beginning of the conversation, but all the way from the start to the finish. I use the quote that you want to talk to your prospects the way you talk to your clients. And the reason you do that is because there's a reason that your clients work with you specifically and not some other wealth advisor. And in the end, it's not really about your investment strategies or your, anything related to finance. It's about who you are as a person and the type of trust that they have in you, right? So really being able to stand out, not blend in, not get get washed into the noise. That's a very simple problem that advisors face, but it basically buries them. So the way you want to treat it is when you're having conversations, you want to think about how can I be casual? How can I be, very friendly? How can I be genuine? And how can I not just sound like a suited up wealth advisor like every single other person that's in this prospect's DM? The way that you do that is from the beginning, from your initial outreach, you want to reach out to them with something that has nothing to do with finances, maybe nothing to do with business, maybe not a very professional greeting in the beginning. You want to treat it like it's someone that you're meeting in person, the way you talk to your friends, because in the end, the people that, prospects trust most are their friends and family. And you want them to see you and perceive you the same way they perceive their friends and family, right? That's what actually creates the trust. And especially now, as more and more prospects and more advisors are on LinkedIn, it just becomes harder to stand out. But in the end, as AI makes kind of everybody sound the same, the more you can stand out from that, it actually just makes it even more effective. So basically, to sum up, the main problem a lot of advisors face when it comes to blending in is just sounding like all the other advisors that are in the prospect's DM. You want to actively go out of your way to find new and unique ways to prospect and new and unique ways to converse. And that actually just comes down to being yourself, right? Because no other wealth advisor can be who you are. And that's what you want to embrace in all of your conversation. And it's honestly a huge factor in terms of the success that the advisors I work with have, which you can see in some of my other videos that I'll link, somewhere connected to this one. So the third most common and most important mistake that wealth advisors are making on LinkedIn is pitch slapping. Obviously, this is a traditional sales approach, whether it's in wealth advisory or any other industry, but specifically for wealth advisory, relating back to the other mistakes I talked about, starting from the mindset and then blending in, that usually comes down to just pitch slapping prospect. Now, your pitches could be the most well-designed sales message ever, but in the end, it's not going to land. And the reason being, unless that prospect knows they need a wealth advisor, knows why they need a wealth advisor, knows how they can get a wealth advisor, they would have already gone out of their way to solve those problems, right? And so with a pitch, you're really just playing the luck game and hoping that you come across a prospect who already understands their problems and knows why they need the help. In reality, as a wealth advisor, I'm sure you would agree, you can probably help the majority of people, especially the ones in your ICP, with one thing or another, right? But the fact that they haven't gone out and solved that problem is because they don't know what the problem is. So the fundamental issue with pitch slapping is that you're trying to look for prospects that know they have a problem, which really just isn't the case. Now, a lot of wealth advisors will come here and say that, oh, well, I just want to get straight to the point. I don't want to beat around the bush. I mean, you can treat it that way, but if you look at your outreach and you feel like you're not having the success that you want, you're not consistently getting clients, it's more luck-based, it's more sporadic, right? You don't have an actual consistent outreach strategy and you're just playing the volume game, then maybe you think about the fact that it's because prospects don't resonate with your pitches, especially if your pitches are just talking about, oh, I'm a wealth advisor on X, Y, and Z team. We solve X, Y, and Z problems. I'd love to have a chat, right? In 2026, prospects don't want to just have friendly chats with random people on LinkedIn, right? They don't know who you are. And until you give them a reason to, actually speak with you, that's never going to happen, right? And in reality, that comes from having a conversation where you find the problems that they're facing, build the trust as I talked about in the last two problems. And then once you have that trust, now they may be willing to actually see how you can help them. So in the end, it's about you helping them realize the problems that they're facing. Just telling them, which is what pitching is, right? It's kind of that mentality of show, not tell, because if you're just telling them, it's never going to land, right? Whereas if you show them the problems that they're having in their own words, that comes from a real conversation. And yeah, it is harder. It does take more time, but that's the reality of the industry on LinkedIn, right? If you wanted to have an easy strategy where there's a perfect golden DM, I've talked to so many wealth advisors that have tried so many different DMs. I myself came from the pitch slapping world before I started this business, and it's a very luck-based strategy. You're never going to get any consistency with it. So pitch slapping is one of the most common problems when we talk about the actual DM itself, beyond the other two more broad issues we faced before. But once you come and get across the idea of just pitch slapping all your prospects, now you can get into having conversations that actually can convert consistently because you're finding true problems and building real trust. If you want more information on that, obviously, as I mentioned, there's other videos that go more in depth there, but that's a very, very common problem that you kind of just have to leave behind entirely and try a different strategy, because the pitch slapping is not going to get any advisor very far. And I've seen it thousands and thousands of times. So the next mistake is very specific to the DMs and the types of conversations that advisors are having. The mistake is having overly formal tonality and just formal tonality in general, right? A lot of advisors are going to talk to their prospects the way that they DM, the way that they converse with them on LinkedIn, even if they are pitch slapping, unfortunately, and maybe they are even having conversations. A lot of times the reasons the conversations don't pan out comes down to the fact that the tonality is way too formal. As I talked about earlier, the whole reason why prospects eventually choose to work with advisors, or maybe why they choose to decide, to actually trust somebody, comes down to the fact that they don't feel like they're talking to a suit and tie, right? In the modern day, and especially the way things are on LinkedIn, the majority of prospects resonate more with a friendlier, more casual, more open tonality. Now, this isn't an easy fix, right? Like, especially with the 50 to 60 advisors I've worked with so far, a lot of times this is something that's challenging because it may not come naturally, right? Especially once I say, like, you want to text prospects the way you text your friends, well, maybe you text your friends formally as well, right? So it's not always the easiest thing to do, but the more casual you can be, the more humorous you can be, and the more open you can be, the easier it's going to be to convert prospects and actually get them to want to engage with you, right? You don't want to text them like you do with your colleagues or anything like that. You want it to make it a friendly relationship, and that comes from the tonality. I honestly tell pretty much every single advisor I work with that the tonality of your DMs matters far more than the actual content of your message. You can say pretty much anything, but if the tonality is right, it's going to land correctly, and that's going to make a conversation that the prospect actually wants to engage in. So this is a huge mistake that really even the advisors who are getting past the other 3 mistakes that I talked about, they get a roadblock in their conversations because they're being way too formal, right? In 2026, you want to treat your outreach as building real friends. Again, going back to the topic of AI, which I can make a whole nother, and probably will make a whole nother video about, when AI talks, it oftentimes sounds way too formal, right? In all of the DMs, it's very obvious, it's very robotic, and so you want to be natural, right? And honestly, this comes back to the first point, which is about not being desperate or even having a salesy mindset. Once you get past that, this whole tonality part of it is just natural. It comes from a place of being genuine, of really just wanting to understand people, build those relationships. And once you're able to do that, it's like you're building friendships and relationships the same way that you would in person. So it's not the easiest solution to fix on LinkedIn, but once you are able to get past that point of having formal tonality, really talking to your prospects the way you would with colleagues or anything like that, now you're able to build those relationships that gets people to open up. So this is a very strong driver of actually having successful conversations. And I would really recommend you look into your tonality and maybe read it out loud, right? The way you read your DMs out loud is, something that I recommend pretty much all of my clients do, because that way you're now able to see what you sound like when it's not just in a text message. Tonality in text messages is obviously a very difficult thing, but this is a huge value driver in terms of converting your conversation. So the 5th most common mistake is, again, later on in conversations, even if advisors have gotten past all the mistakes that we've talked to until this point, it's an awkward transition where you maybe start a good, genuine conversation in the beginning. You're maybe having some casual banter back and forth. Maybe you're even having good tonality and building a real friendship/relationship, but now you're not able to transition into asking for business, right? So a lot of advisors, the mistake they make is they ruin all of the rapport they've just built once they pitch the prospect that they're talking to. This happens to me all the time as well, right? Even being in this industry, wealth advisors still try to pitch me, and I engage in the conversations to see what types of strategies and mistakes that they're making. And this pretty much happens every single time. Even to the people who are able to get replies and have conversations, they're still not able to transition that into business. Oftentimes what this comes down to is, again, the first issue, which, as I said before, is going to branch out to pretty much everything else, where your mindset is always stuck on the sales and the desperation and closing clients. If you have the genuine mindset where you're not even trying to sell people, you just want to see if there's a way for you to help or actually understand them first, then the transition comes very naturally, right? Now, again, this isn't the easiest thing to do because it comes down to being able to find the real problems that are underlying for your prospects. And that comes from being able to ask good questions, right? Where your questions are natural, they're well connected to the conversation, they don't feel pitchy, they don't feel like you're trying to sell, they don't feel like high pressure. When prospects are able to answer those questions and in their responses, you're able to see the problems that they're facing, especially as they relate to finances. Now the transition is very natural, right? Again, look at some of the other videos that I've made that are going to dive deeper into some of these conversation examples. But this problem is probably the most important last step to solve before you can actually consistently book discovery calls and close clients from LinkedIn. Because once you're able to have a transition where it doesn't feel like you're not genuine from the start, right? Because a lot of times maybe you built rapport, but then the prospect feels, oh, this is what he wanted all along, right? When I tell people my strategy, sometimes advisors think the same way, like, oh, so we're really just trying to trick them. That's not really what it's about at all, right? If somebody's asked you like, oh, what is the gist of this conversation? Or why are you even asking me all these questions? Why are we having this conversation in the first place? Where's your pitch, right? All you say is what your mindset should genuinely be, which is, well, really, I'm not in the business of pitching people because I don't even know anything about you. I don't know if I can help you. I have a lot of conversations with people in your space. And so I always just like to enjoy them and get to know people. And if there's room to help, then great. And so really that factor is what makes the transition so much easier because it doesn't feel forced. It doesn't feel pressure. This is a step and a skill that takes a long time to develop. And obviously this is a very quick overview of it. I'll get into maybe a little bit more in a different video on how to actually find those problems. But really the biggest hack is that your conversation should never feel like there's a transition at all. It comes from asking the good questions from the very beginning of the conversation where you're understanding them personally, you're building rapport, but at the same time, you're just understanding more about their situation very naturally. And as the conversation progresses, you can get more specific in the questions that you're asking since you're building rapport at the same time. Again, it's a skill that takes some time to solve. Look at my other video that goes over the strategy to see an example of this. But these awkward transitions is what even the advisors who get conversations going, this is where they usually fall flat. So yeah, hopefully that was helpful as well in understanding an issue that a lot of you may be facing. So there we have it. Those are the 5 mistakes that I see wealth advisors making on LinkedIn most often. And it really holds more than 95% of them back from ever signing clients on the platform. And even if they do, it's usually very sporadic and very luck-based. So one thing I can tell you is don't expect any of these solutions to be easy, right? The reason why a consistent DM strategy is so effective is because it takes time to learn, it's difficult, and it really is a skill, right? Since it's a skill, that's why not every single advisor can do it. The industry has a 90% failure rate under 3 years for a reason, right? It's very difficult, but once you're able to have that consistent strategy and stand out from what everyone else is doing, building real trust with your prospects, finding the problems that they're facing, and simply naturally offering your help, you're able to see that growth just from LinkedIn consistently month over month. If you're an advisor who wants to build that consistent DM strategy, book a call with me at the link below, and we can go over if my program is potentially a fit for you. Our biggest focus is teaching the actual skills behind this DM strategy, and so you can have it for the long term. You don't have to rely on luck or look to really any other prospecting avenue because you'll get all the clients you need from LinkedIn, and it's a skill you'll have so you don't have to rely on anyone else for the rest of your career. Let me know if that's something that interests you. Obviously, feel free to DM me on LinkedIn, and I hope this video was helpful. Thanks.